In Warzone Season 4, the performance your game's running at can make or break every gunfight. So today we're going to take a look at the best settings that will improve your FPS and visibility in Warzone Season 4. Hey everyone, it's FourEyes Dave here, welcome back to another video. Today we are doing a settings video for Warzone Season 4. I do one of these basically every season, even if only a couple of things have changed here and there. When these games get updated, especially for these big season updates, sometimes performance can vary from season to season. Certain settings change, new settings come in, and it's good to get everyone on the same playing field because as long as your hardware supports the game, you don't want to be being hindered by bad settings. It's the worst thing you can do. You need to make sure all this stuff is dialed in properly so you can have the best FPS that your rig can handle, as well as improving your visibility while you're playing. So, without further ado, let's jump into the settings and see what I am currently running to get the best performance. If you guys do enjoy this video, then be sure to subscribe down below for more Warzone videos coming very soon. And also follow me over on Twitter, where we will be having discussions all about Season 4 of Warzone and other FPS games in the future. Battlefield, Halo, we're talking about it all over there. It'll be nice to have some chats with you guys over there as well. So let's start off with a couple of important points on the general tab. This is a tab which I don't want to quickly breeze over because there is some stuff which actually relates quite nicely to graphics, visibility, FPS and all those sort of things before we actually go into the graphics menu. So field of view, I play with mine on the max 120 so I can get the maximum amount of vision around me. I don't want to be missing someone who's coming across one of the sides of me, but having a higher FOV naturally means that you will have lower FPS because there's more being rendered in actually on your screen at a time. Now, the impact of this isn't a crazy amount, so this is kind of up to your own testing and more personal preference. You might find that you enjoy just playing at 100 more because things don't seem so far away from you. You can actually pick out enemies a bit easier. So in terms of visibility, this is actually a setting which is kind of personal preference. I prefer to just shove it on the max and get the most FOV and then just like really dial in my kind of focus when I'm playing. And that's what I'd recommend you guys to get used to doing if you can. If it is affecting FPS for you because you have a lower end rig, then just drop this down to probably 100. Lowest I would go is 90. I wouldn't really go anywhere below that because then you're really starting to get to the realms of like playing on console. Sorry, console players. Next up, brightness. I would just instantly shove this on 65. It's a little bit higher than the standard. Don't go based on this not visible, barely visible thing over here. Just shove it on 65. It will just brighten up some of the areas before we actually go on to some of the other settings we're going on to in a minute. Down a little bit, we've got the colorblind target and type. Now, I actually am colorblind, so this was a setting I had on already, but I found out that a lot of people are running the colorblind setting on because it just improves all the colors on your screen and makes them look a lot more poppy, a lot more natural. There is that kind of filter of colors over the game at the moment ever since the Cold War update. So was it the Cold War update? The going back in time, sorry, in the last season. So the colorblind target should be set to both, and the colorblind type should be set to deuteranopia, and that will just make your colors overall better. Go try it out. I swear to God, this makes everything look a lot nicer. If we come down a little bit further, the last thing I would do in terms of visibility, it's kind of an extra thing, is to make sure your mini-map shape is on square. You can even see over on the right here that having a square mini-map gives you so much more vision. You can see this kind of corner over here on these on this raised area. This is on one of the gunfight maps in Modern Warfare multiplayer. You can't see that on the circle maps, so there's no point running the circle. The square is always better. Lastly, in the telemetry section down here, just enable basically all of this. The only thing I haven't enabled is my GPU temperature because I don't really find the need for it. But the main things to have on are your FPS counter, so you know if you're ever dipping and know if there's any problems you're having, as well as server latency and packet loss. Server latency will typically be something which potentially is harder for you to control. Maybe there's just a server issue. Packet loss is probably something more on your end, something to do with your router, something to do with your actual internet. So having all of this stuff on is useful just to know when things aren't exactly running correctly, and you know instantly that something needs to be fixed. You want to have all this on, otherwise you'll miss that. Okay, into the graphics settings. Display mode. We want this set to full screen. If you set this to anything other than full screen, even on Windows 10, which has a pretty well put together full screen borderless mode. Full screen will just give your game priority to be rendered in. It's not going to be having anything going on in the background. It's not like you're kind of rendering something in a window, but then there's other things happening on your PC. This gives your game the most priority and gives you the most smooth experience, so you don't end up having input lag. If you really have a problem with the alt tabbing, sometimes some people have real big problems alt tabbing out of games in full screen, then you can go for full screen borderless, but you will potentially experience some input lag. So full screen or full screen borderless, whatever kind of suits your use case. Next is make sure you've got your correct display monitor. So mine actually says my Elgato because that's where I'm actually sending it to. For you, it would just be whatever your standard monitor is. Display adapter, just ensure that you've got the correct GPU set selected here. There should almost only ever be one, but maybe if you've got an integrated graphics in your processor and that's showing up, just make sure you're not rendering on the wrong card or something stupid like that. Screen refresh rate, turn this up to the max that your monitor supports. I've got a 240Hz monitor, so mine's set to 240. A lot of you guys will have 144Hz or even maybe 60Hz. I would recommend, if you're on 60Hz, get up to 144Hz. They're not that expensive, these monitors now, and they will improve your gameplay massively. Even if you're not able to hit 144 FPS, it will still feel a lot smoother. Render resolution, typically just keep this to 100. This basically means that we're not super sampling, we're not rendering the game at 4K on your 1080p monitor. Just set this to 100. If you're having real problems with FPS down the line, you can lower this down to some lower resolutions, but that should be really a last resort because it will hinder your visibility dramatically if you do so. Aspect ratio, automatic. It should automatically put it to whatever your monitor is. For me, that's 16:9. For a lot of you, that'll be the case. If you have an ultra wide or a wide monitor, then you might have one of these ones down here. Sync every frame, or VSync. Disable this. If you're someone who's running G-Sync, then typically you will want to be enabling VSync and G-Sync in your like NVIDIA settings or your AMD settings or however you want to do it. You don't want to do it in-game, so keep this disabled in-game. It will add input latency, which is not nice, makes the game harder to play, makes the game feel a lot more sloppy. Custom frame rate limit, just shove that on unlimited. You can set individual frame rate limits for potentially things like when you're alt-tabbed out the game or when you're on the menu. The reason I don't like doing that is because I find that I end up running into more glitches where I'll be at like 60 FPS in my menu, but then when I get into the game, it like doesn't seem to kick up the FPS. I'm having this variable frame rate and the game gets confused in itself. The game doesn't work perfectly all the time, so having just it set to unlimited or having at least all of these frame rate limits set the same means that the game's not getting confused at any point, and overall a smoother experience. NVIDIA highlights, this should just be disabled unless you are really enjoying using that feature. There's many other ways you can get recordings of your games, either using OBS, like I'm recording this video with. Low key is another one which I know people use. In general, you don't want something which is constantly running in the background because it's just taking up resources on your PC that you don't need to be using. So keep NVIDIA highlights off. NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency, have this at enabled plus boost. This, as you can read on the side, enables a low latency mode that NVIDIA uses. It keeps GPU clock frequencies high in CPU bound cases. Basically, it just keeps your GPU pumping, keeps latency low. Input latency is a massive thing in shooters, and we want to keep that as low as possible. And NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency is a really awesome piece of kit that really works to do that for us. If you're having any problems with the game, just random things not loading in, textures having issues, always go to this restart shaders installation. You can only get to this if you open up the options menu from the from the beginning menu before you've even clicked Warzone, where you've got Modern Warfare, Warzone, and Cold War. You can come in here. You can restart your shaders installation. Takes a different amount of time for different people, I know, but you'll end up with a game that's running a lot better afterwards. This is like a very, very easy fix to many, many problems that people have. Display gamma, if you are playing on a monitor, then you want to use sRGB or 2.2. If you're playing on a TV screen, then 2.4 is the color space you want to be using. But for me, I'm on a monitor, so display gamma. Next, we're coming down to details and textures. Streaming quality. This is an interesting one. I always used to have this on low because it says on the right, favors texture performances over quality. This value is recommended if you have less than 4 gig of memory. Or normal, which favors texture quality over performance. I was like, well, I want performance, so I'm going to go with low. But what I found is that there was very little difference in performance between these two, if any, in most of my cases. Maybe if you have, it says this value is recommended if you have less than 4 gig of video memory. Maybe if you have that, then low would be your option. But if you're over that amount, having this set to normal gets your textures loaded in much quicker. Texture fidelity stays high whenever you're moving into new areas. You don't have as many kind of bumps and glitches when you're playing. And it overall leads to a much better visible experience as you play. So I'd recommend keeping this at normal if you have a graphics card, as it says, with over 4 gig of video memory, which a lot of people do now. Texture resolution, I keep this at normal. Anything lower than normal makes things start looking really, really rough. Once again, texture resolution and how much it impacts your game is really dependent on how much VRAM you have. I've got 8 gig of VRAM, so it doesn't affect me. If you have anything over 4, once again, I keep it at normal. If you're under 4, maybe go down to low. You can see it really does affect the VRAM usage at the top here, bumping it up by quite a bit, just under a gig of extra video memory. So pick and choose, see what works for you, but normal will give you the kind of the best bang for your buck. Texture filter anisotropic. This is one which basically had no effect on my FPS, but having it turned up, it says improves your texture quality of surfaces when viewed at an angle. This will just improve visibility. It'll improve when enemies are sat in front of walls. I think people won't blend in as much. General, just textures don't blend as much together. Yes, it might look like we're turning a lot of settings high. A lot of people expect to come into these settings videos and me just to go turn all these to low. No, that's not what we're doing. We're trying to balance FPS and that performance as well as the visibility. So texture, filter, anisotropic, put it to normal or high. Honestly, you shouldn't have any problems running this on higher and it will make things way more visible. Particle quality is a very weird one. It would make sense to run this on low, but what people have actually found is that in general cases, having it on high improves your FPS, like most of the time in the game, for some reason. I haven't really noticed the difference, but I've read from a lot of different cases, a lot of other YouTube videos, that keeping this on high improves your FPS. Why? We don't know, but just do it. Bullets, impacts, and sprays, no effect on FPS. I just like to keep them on because it adds to that realism. I can see where I shot. If I missed someone, it might come in useful. It's one of these things where there's no reason to have it off, so I just keep it on because I like the look of it. Tessellation, I keep this disabled because this is something which does draw a bit more from your GPU. This is a bit more of a complex thing for your GPU to handle. It's, as it says here, it changes the amount of scene geometry, which receives subdivision for improved rendering quality. This is kind of similar to texture filter anisotropic. It just kind of pushes that a lot further and gives you much more 3D effect. It technically could improve some level of visibility, but as I said, it does hinder your performance more than some of these other settings. So I keep this to disabled. And lastly, on-demand texture streaming. I've kept this to disabled. I haven't done a huge amount of testing on this where you can basically, I believe you can download the textures into a cache. This might improve performance for some people. I'd recommend you go and do some research into this. For me, I've kept it to disabled. I've tried it out, turning this up and even putting this up to 64 gigs and just playing around with it, but it really didn't do much to me. And I don't really want to be using internet bandwidth for that kind of thing. So I just leave it to disabled. It works well for me. I'd recommend go play around with it yourselves and see how it works for you. Next, shadow and lighting. This is a very important section. There's a lot of FPS gains to be had here. So, shadow map resolution. Ideally, I'd put this on low because low does give performance benefits. But my God, the shadows look terrible. They're so distracting. They're so blobby. The whole game is just awful to look at. So I kind of force myself to play with this on normal because the jump in quality and visibility is tenfold. The drop in performance is not that bad. If you are running on a really low end system, you're going to have to run this on low to improve your FPS. That's just a standard for most games for running shadows. But for someone like myself, shadow map resolution to normal is great. Cache spot shadows and cache sun shadows. I've seen a lot of debate on this, but basically what this does is it stores certain shadows into the cache to speed up rendering. Now, if you've got a solid amount of RAM and VRAM, I'm talking I've got 16 gigs of RAM and 8 gigs of VRAM. You can go research into this if you want, but I've found in most cases when you've got basically a standard modern day setup with a good amount of RAM and VRAM. Having these both to enable just makes your game run smoother because you're storing certain render pieces on your PC, so they're ready to go. It's not having to load them back in. In general, enabling caches in games, it can take up more space on your system, but it will make the game run better and improve visibility. It does both. So keep these enabled. Particle lighting, I've just always kept this to normal. Having it higher than normal can start bogging down your FPS. It's kind of similar to shadow map resolution. Having it on low makes things look horrible. Having it on normal, you'll lose a couple of FPS, 2 or 3 FPS, but it makes the game look way better. And there's a lot of different particle lighting that happens in this game, from explosions and fires and stuff like that. And you can in general just see people better when through those kind of explosions and fire. So keep this on normal. DirectX ray tracing, if you even have this, if you have a COD that supports this, do not run it in Warzone. This is something for campaign, for realism. It's not something for Warzone. It will absolutely destroy your FPS. I'd love to see a future where this doesn't destroy FPS, but for the moment that's not the case. It's not worth it. Keep it off. Ambient occlusion, keep that off as well. This is another thing which, when you start dialing this up, it really starts to affect your FPS, and it's more of a realism looking thing. It doesn't affect visibility really. It's just something which adds something to the game to make the game look a bit kind of nicer, more realistic, but no help in a competitive scenario. So we'll keep that off. And then screen space reflections. Maybe there's some sort of scenario where having a reflection might be able to lead you to see something. I don't think that's ever the case, though. This is just another thing which is being rendered in for realism that we don't need, so we keep it off. Lastly, we're into the last section. Filmic strength. I'll come back to this one in a second. Nvidia DLSS. This is something which they only added in the last season, and I'll keep saying the same thing for this for basically everyone. If you have a GPU that supports DLSS, do one of these two things. If you're running at 1080p, like I am, in general, keep this disabled. If you start turning this up, things start looking very blurry and it doesn't work that well. If you are running the game at 2K resolution, I would actually recommend that you turn this to quality. As you can see here, offers a higher image quality than balanced mode, recommended for 2K gameplay. So 2560 by 1440, basically, 2K. What DLSS is essentially like turning down the render resolution. What we do is it turns down the render resolution, basically giving you more FPS, but then what it does is it super samples back up using AI back to the resolution you're playing at. So if you were at 2K, it would render the game at 1920 by 1080p, and then upscale it back without any performance loss. If you try and do this when you're already at 1080p, it doesn't really look nice. If you're at higher, you can start using these settings. The higher resolution you're playing at, the more towards the performance side you go. So if you're at 2K, you go for quality. If you're at 4K, you go for performance. And if you're somehow at 8K playing Warzone, then first of all, well done. Second of all, yeah, you can run ultra performance and see how that runs. I've got no idea what that will look like, but that's what it says to do. So just follow the tooltip. Anti-aliasing. I've consistently ran this at the max setting, Filmic SMAA to T2X. The anti-aliasing and the kind of the jaggedness of edges in this game is horrible. With all the trees that are always in the background and the denseness of what's on your screen, I find having this at anything apart from Filmic SMAA T2X just makes the game look way worse for me. So I turn this to the max here, and then if you see where it says Filmic Strength, it says if the anti-aliasing option is not set to either SMAA T2X or Filmic SMAA T2X, then set this to 1. So the other option you can do here is if you want to gain a little bit of FPS, but I think it does affect visibility, come down to SMAA 1X and then turn up your Filmic Strength to 1. This will look a little bit sharper than Filmic SMAA, but just way more jaggedness and like haziness. It looks horrible. And when I show you my filters later on, you'll see that having this Filmic setting plus the filters gives you a really sharp looking image. Lastly, let's blast through these last settings. disable all of this random stuff, motion blur and depth of field, film grain, and dynamic resolution. This is all stuff which we do not need in a competitive shooter. It will not help us out one bit. Lastly, in these settings, I just want to show you what my audio mix is. I'm currently running Boost High. I've found that this gives the best sounds of footsteps in game when people are moving around you. A lot of other people agree with this, and so that's what I'd recommend running here. So the last thing I want to cover in this video is my Nvidia filters. I've only recently moved over to using Nvidia filters recently. I felt like I needed them more this season than the last season, or at least this season and last season, since the map changed to the Verdansk 84 with the kind of weird colors and the weird haziness. I felt that Nvidia filters have been necessary, but I do them a little bit different from how other people do them in order to maintain some of my FPS, because running these filters, especially running a lot of them, can have a big effect on your system. So what I will show you before we jump into a game is you press Alt-Z on your keyboard, then you go to Game Filter. You have to have this on. You have to have your whole overlay on in your Nvidia settings. You can find tutorials on how to do that elsewhere. And I have 2 bits added, which are details and brightness and contrast. You'll see a lot of people who add things like the sharpen filter, as well as the I can't remember which one. It's the color filter. I see a lot of people add both of those, but what I'm going to quickly show you before we go into these settings is how you can get those effects, so a sharper image and better colors, without using Nvidia filters, and therefore saving you some FPS. So from your desktop, right-click your desktop and go to NVIDIA Control Panel. Obviously, this is NVIDIA only. There's probably some AMD way of doing this, but I don't know it. You're going to have your NVIDIA Control Panel open, and we're going to do 2 things. For the sharpness for our game, come to the Manage 3D Settings area over on the left. Go to Program Settings. Make sure you've got Call of Duty Modern Warfare selected, which is up here. And then you'll see that there's a specific setting you can set for the game called Image Sharpening. This is essentially going to be the same as the Sharpen filter in the Nvidia filters in game, but this doesn't affect your FPS whatsoever, whereas that one does. So I set mine to 0.65 with 0.17 ignore film grain. That's how it works best for me. That might be a little bit too sharp for some of you guys. You might want to try something like 0.55, but I believe in the range of 0.5 and 0.7. This counteracts the kind of blurriness you get from the filmic anti-aliasing that I put on, and gives you a really sharp image with no haziness and no jagged edges, and it looks awesome. Once you've done that, you can press apply down here, and that's the sharpness dialed in. The second thing is the colors. So what we do for that is we go to adjust desktop color settings, go to your monitor that you're playing the game on, and turn your digital vibrance, which is at the bottom here, up from the default 50% to around 63%. This might only seem like a small bump, but I'm telling you, if you start going above like 70%, the game looks, in my opinion, way too colourful. It's like everything is like colour puke in your face. It's not nice. But that's a really easy setting. If you want to do this on a game-by-game basis, so you don't want it to affect your desktop, you can get an application called Vibrance GUI. I won't put any links to it or anything, just search it up, and it will basically allow you to set digital vibrance for NVIDIA on a game-by-game basis. So you can basically say, when I open Warzone, change the digital vibrance to 63%. When I Alt-Tab out of it or I close it, change it back to 50% so that it doesn't affect your monitor. I like having this turned up for my main monitor because it makes videos and stuff look a lot nicer anyway. So those 2 settings, dial those in before you do your Nvidia filters. Now let's get back in game and see what my filters do to improve your visibility. Okay, so this is what my game would look like if I had no Nvidia filters on. You can see there's this haziness to the image. The colors are better than they were already, and I think that's just because of the vibrance thing that I've got turned up, but everything looks a bit kind of wrong. The shadows are really, really dark. The colors don't really pop, and we're going to do some improvements and hopefully not get killed. There's a guy down to my right. See if he spots me. Doesn't look like he has, but let's have a look at what my filters do. Now, hopefully you've noticed the difference there. What I'll actually do is I will add a split screen to this. you can kind of just about see the differences. Now, details is the first filter you want to add. I don't add a sharpen on details because I've already got my sharpen from my Nvidia filters. Clarity, I turn this... someone's killed me. Perfect. Anyway, continuing on after I was rudely interrupted. Clarity basically is one of the first bits that gets rid of some of the haze. It looks like it kind of sharpens the image, but it's not really sharpening, it's just getting rid of the haze. You can literally see on the right, as I pull this down, it just gets hazier and hazier. And you turn this up to around, I put it on about 90%, and you just got that crispness to the image. Next is HDR toning. This is a massive one, and this is really what pulls out some of the shadows so you don't have such dark areas. As you turn this up, and I turn this to about 40%, a lot of those dark areas just kind of disappear, and this really helps with all your rose skins and all of that kind of stuff because you don't want to have people hiding in corners. And HDR toning, just turning that up a bit, really pushes that so you don't have to be getting killed from random places. Bloom is not a setting which we want. It completely blows out the image. It looks horrible, so we keep that on 0%. Let me just move around a little bit so we don't get the AFK warning. There we go. As we go prone, that's fine. And then the second filter I use is brightness and contrast. Exposure, I keep on 0. This, once again, is kind of similar to that bloom effect. It just blows out the image. It's basically a brightness that we don't want to play with, so we keep that on 0. Contrast, I push that up just so it kind of pushes the colors a bit. I had it a bit lower than I usually have it. I've got like usually on 31% or so. It just provides a bit more definition between certain colors and light and dark areas. It really just improves the clarity. I don't know why I'm doing that. It just really improves the clarity. It looks so much nicer. Highlight, I turn down a little bit. What that does is, especially the clouds, it makes the clouds not as bright. If you turn this down even more to around, I think about 40%, you can really start getting rid of some of that glare from the sun that you get in the game at the moment. It looks awful. Everyone hates it. Turning down your highlights will sort that out nicely. Shadows, if we look at these on 0%, you can see like the shadows in the building over on the right are really, really hard to see. But as we turn down shadows, they just kind of fade away. And I put my shadows on about minus 70%. When you go inside a building, if I run over to a building here very quickly, if we just run on over here and get inside, like look as I turn, even just like these little dark corners, they become just a bit brighter. You might say maybe unnaturally bright, but I want to be able to see people. I don't want someone to be over hiding that corner. I want them to be able to pop out, and I want to be able to see them straight away. So that's shadows, and then the final thing is the gamma, which is basically the last bit I touch up. If you think overall your game's too dark, turn the gamma up. If you think it's too bright, turn the gamma down. This is all going to depend on your monitor and kind of what brightness and color settings your monitor has. But for me, those settings are what work the best. So what we can do right now, just as a last comparison, let's jump out this window and we'll do a comparison out here. Game filter. This is them on. This is them off. On, off. On, off. So much better, so much more clarity, and my FPS is still decently high. So overall, it's a massive win for us. Anyway, guys, that is the end of this video. This has been very, very packed, full of information. I really wanted to do well by you guys this season and giving you guys literally every bit of information you need to know. If you want a video on things like Windows settings, config files, I didn't cover that in this video because I just wanted to cover stuff that you can quite easily do just as a consumer, as a player. But if you want to go more in depth and learn about all the little bits and pieces for improving this game's performance, right to the back end stuff, then I can do a video on that as well. Just leave a comment down below telling me if you're interested in that. And that's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you guys in my next video. Bye bye.